Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I think people will join. Welcome to this fourth class. As always, we have our regular attendees. Let's just take a moment to center ourselves, feel the enormous grace to be present here, to be able to study these deep teachings. Let us do a few rounds of double inhale intense to center our awareness into the body. Double exhale. Twice more. Last time. Keeping our awareness centered. I hope I'm audible. We'll start with a chant and then we'll do a short meditation and then we'll start our class. Let me just set the live performance. Yeah, should be better. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I live, from joy I came. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I live, from joy I live. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred, from joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. From joy I came, for joy I live. In sacred joy I melt. this experience of joy, this experience of bliss, of God, of Gurus. Let us make this presence of our Gurus even more tangible with a prayer to invoke thy blessings, invoke their presence, bringing our hands near the heart, gazing at the spiritual eye, consciously opening our hearts. Let us pray. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashay, Swami Shri Yukteswar Ji, beloved Gurudev Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, saints and sages of all religion, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. O great ones, come to us, be with us, guide us, open our hearts so that we could feel thee, so that we could attune to thee, so that we could learn these sacred teachings, uplift our consciousness, enlighten our minds, fill us with your grace. Oh, let us take a few brief moments in silence to really feel our Guru's blessings, their grace. Om Shanti. Welcome once again. Welcome everyone. So this is our fourth class, uh, and we haven't gotten far. But as we have been really understanding that there's so many layers of meaning that it's never enough, howsoever we try, howsoever we go and try to be in attunement with these teachings, there's always a layer of meaning, there's always a new perspective which comes to us. So, taking that spirit, we'll move forward. So, in last class, we did the sutra second, third, and fourth. Just to quickly remind us, these three sutras were starting with defining what is yoga, which is as Patanjali defines yoga, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Then moving on to establish what happens when we are in the state of yoga, where he says that Tada Drashtu Swarupena Avasthanam, that the seer rests in its own self in the state of yoga. And then what happens when it's not? Then there is vritti sarupram itiratra, right? So then there is identification, then there is sort of becoming of those vrittis, right? So we identify with those vrittis, and our chitta takes those outward forms as those vrittis are, right? Now, going forward, now what Patanjali will do is again very scientifically, Patanjali will now bring us to what these different vrittis are, right? And sometimes, and it's a mistake all of us, or especially in my own journey, I've seen myself making that thinking that these sutras are probably more to do with theory, or they are rather more theoretical in sense to really just give some definitions and may not be as relevant in our practice, right? But as we've been realizing, even through these four sutras till now, that whatever Patanjali is going to say, it has to have a very deep meaning. And more than meaning, it has to really correspond to some practice, right? Because from the very beginning, as Patanjali has already established, that this is going to be a practice, a discipline, a study of yoga, where we are going to really practice the principles of yoga, right? And that's where even when Patanjali is describing these vrittis, classifying these vrittis, as Patanjali says, these are not to be taken lightly. These are not to be taken as mere theory, but there is a lot of understanding which is hidden, and that's why we need great sages, self-realized masters, a lineage to really bring out those subtle hidden meanings, because in the face of these sutras they are just bullet points, right, as we have been discussing. So what we'll do is we'll first try and go through these sutras. In this class, we'll probably try to be more ambitious, and we'll try to cover up the next 6 or 7 sutras. Let's see how much we can. At least we'll try to at least take the next 6 sutras, which define these five of vrittis. And then obviously he goes on to talk about how to really control these vrittis, right? So till now, what we have really understood is what is the issue, what is the problem with vrittis, right? So the most important problem with vritti is that we become identified with that vritti, right? And what happens out of that is that while in our true state we are Satchidananda, we are Purusha, we are manifestation of God, we are sons of God, right? We are made in the image of God. But as we become identified with these vrittis then take us for a ride, right? And then we go through the ups and downs of these vrittis, because the vrittis have a nature of Prakriti. It has a nature of ups and lows, highs and lows, crests and troughs, right? Because that's how duality is created. And that's what we understood from the explanation of Sankhya, that essentially this whole Prakriti coming from zero has to have all of these positives and negatives, which will ultimately balance when we finally go to that state of Purusha, or go to that state of Satchidananda. Right. So the problem with vritti is that once we become identified with vritti, we go on for a ride of duality, ride of Prakriti, and that creates all the suffering, right? And all of these sufferings have a more of a psychological nature to it, right? And that is what now Patanjali is going to really bring out through these definitions of vrittis, right? So in the next sutra, that is in the Sutra 1.5, now Patanjali is going to tell us about what are these five classifications of vrittis, right? So Patanjali will tell us that there are five classifications very scientifically again, and it will then each of these five in the next 5 verses, Patanjali will describe each of these five kinds of vrittis, right? So the first, as we are describing, the first sutra, or the sutra we are taking first in this class, which is the fifth sutra, Patanjali is going to describe the five classifications of these vrittis and their nature, right? So Patanjali says that vrityaya, panchatyaya, klishta, aklishta, right? I will come to the meaning of these sutras. So as Swamiji describes in his commentary, he says that there are five classifications of vrittis which are painful and not painful, right? Or painless, right? So Patanjali says vritya, which is he's talking about vritti, panchtyaya, which means fivefold, or these are of five kinds, klishta and aklishta, right? Now, klishta means something which is painful, but more than painful, the nature of klishta is that it comes from kleshas, right? Now, what kleshas are, we'll not go into the philosophy of it, but it's essentially there is the nature of kleshas, that there is a nature of binding. There is a nature of proliferation of a suffering of psychological kind, right? So it's like, and this is an example which is given by Buddha, right? So Buddha says, suppose you are in a forest, right? And you are hit by a arrow, right? Now if you're hit by an arrow, obviously it's painful, right? Because arrow has entered your body and it is paining, and blood is oozing out of that wound. But say when you're looking at that wound, and then you start thinking about, oh, shot this arrow, what did I really do? What was the karma that brought this pain into me? Now, what will happen to my children and progeny and all that, right? So, what we are doing, we are proliferating that suffering, the first suffering or that pain, which now takes a form of an entire sort of psychological nature of psychological suffering, right? And Buddha goes on to say that all the teachings we are all the things we learn on spiritual path is to remove that second kind of suffering, right? Which is of the psychological kind, which is coming out of those kleshas or the identifications of ourself with that event, right? In this case, being shot by an arrow, right? So obviously there is pain in the body, but then beyond pain, we sort of we in a way we proliferate that pain and we hold on to that pain, and then we sort of make that we in a way also relish that pain, relish that hurt, right? And we go through when we're going through the vrittis, we'll understand how it really forms. And there's also an example which is given by master when a particular devotee or a particular woman tells a master about a suffering she had in her past, and it was some surgery or some I think some physical condition which was very painful. And then the master said, oh, how he was really sympathizing with her, but then he asked, when did it happen? And she said it happened about 20 years ago, right? And then master said that you are still sort of continuing that pain, right? So that is the nature of vritti, right? So there was pain, there was an event, there was suffering perhaps, but then that physical suffering, we sort of we because of that vritti which is starting to form around that event, around that physical suffering, and us investing into that vritti, we become identified with that pain, and then we become so identified that it becomes our whole identity, right? We start to define our life, we start to define our personality, we define our choices, we define where we land up in life, all based on that vritti, right? And that is how strong the self-identification becomes. And our entire life then starts to revolve around that self-identification, right? If only we could have controlled that vritti when it was starting, we could have really sort of gone beyond and transcended even that physical or maybe some amount of mental pain, right, which was there. But then, because of our involvement, because of our investment, because of our sort of giving power, energy to that vritti, it becomes so strong that then it becomes almost impossible to really control that. It becomes like a mad elephant, right? And that is what Patanjali is helping us look at and then helping us control it, right? And that is why Patanjali says the entire science of yoga, the state of yoga, the process of yoga is all about nirodha of these vrittis, right? These vrittis which are happening in our chitta, in our heart, in our feeling space, the controlling that where as it is arising is really being in a state of yoga, right? And Patanjali will also help us understand the different states of our mind, right? And obviously there are different ways we can reach to that state of nirodha, right? Which is not easy. But Patanjali describes that there are different stages through which we reach or we go towards that state of nirodha, right? And he again classifies them as something like Shipta, Vikshipta, Moodha, Ekagra, and Niruddha, right? We will come to that definition of each of these and we come to the of those verses, but essentially it is saying that either our mind is scattered, either our mind is turmoiled, either our mind is dull, which is called Moodha, or it is Ekagra, which is one-pointed or concentrated. And then when we become, our mind becomes concentrated, we get that ability to control or restrain these vrittis, and then it goes into that state of nirodha, right? So first, Patanjali in this sutra is first setting the context that there are five of these vrittis and they can be either klishta or aklishta, right? Now, klishta, as we understood, is a form of pain, is a form of suffering, is a form of misery, right? And it is something which we sort of also proliferate with our investment identification with that suffering, with that misery. And it could be aklishta, which means non-binding or non-afflictive or not painful, right? Which means that there was a vritti, just like the first arrow which shot the man, right? There were, as the arrow was shot, there was obviously a physical suffering, there was a mental suffering, which was direct result of that arrow being shot. But that could be aklishta if we don't buy into that, if we don't invest our identity into it, if we don't become so engrossed with it that we keep attending to it, right? And that is the way we really proliferate a vritti, right? So that is what Patanjali is going to say, that these are of five kinds which can be either painful or not painful, right? But obviously, as we'll go through the sutras commentaries, Swamiji also talks about it, that they can never be really, they can never give us the soul happiness, the soul bliss, right? They can give us, a vritti can give us pleasure, some amount of temporary pleasure, but they can never really give us happiness, right? True joy, because that is a nature of soul, right? And whenever the soul is identified with a vritti, it will always be conditioned. It will always be limited. It will always be bound, right? As we understood the meaning of a vritti, vrit, which is a circular sort of a circumference binding or a sort of measuring something, right? It's putting a limit to something. Right. So in the next verse, so first Patanjali has described the five kinds and the nature as being painful or not painful. Then Patanjali is going to describe each of these, right? In fact, first Patanjali will describe all five, name all five of them, and then describe each of them, right? So Patanjali then in the next verse says that I'll also repeat the Sanskrit so that it's easy for us to also relate if you have some context of these words with the real meaning, with the subtle meaning of these sutras, right? While the English translation also I'll repeat from Swamiji, and then we'll try and take a quick look at that, right? So the verse in the Sutra 1.6, Patanjali says, Praman Viparyaya Vikalpa Smriti Nidra, right? So there are five of these vrittis. Praman, which is right knowledge or right conception. Viparyaya, which is wrong knowledge or wrong conception. Then there is Vikalpa, which means imagination or fanciful thoughts, right? Then there is Nidra. Nidra, I'll talk about it more, but essentially you can take it as deep sleep, right? A state of complete absorption in sleep, right? And then there is Smriti, which is memory, right? So these are five of the vrittis. And now we will go the next verse. Patanjali will start describing the definition or the qualities of each of these five vrittis, right? So first is the praman, right? Praman, which is as in English translated by Swamiji is right knowledge or right conception, right? So now in the next verse or next sutra 1.7, Patanjali says Pratyaksha Anuman Agamaha Pramanani, which means this praman, what is the meaning of praman, right? Or how can we really take something as right knowledge? So Patanjali says there are three aspects that we need to have to really say something as truth, right? Or right conception or right knowledge. So these three things are, first he says pratyaksha, which is a direct perception, right? Pratyaksha means something in front, something which is directly perceivable, right? Now it need not be a physical perception, it could also be a perception of a thought or a feeling or a sensation, right? But it has to be the perception of what is, right? If it is perceiving something which is not, then there is a different kind of vritti, right? So pratyaksha is something which is directly perceivable through our senses or through our senses of perception, essentially, right? So that is first criteria, the first criteria, which is then pratyaksha, that either it could be through or it has to have that direct perception. Then he says anuman, right? And anuman means inference, right? So there are sort of there are situations when we cannot directly perceive something, right? Like air, for example, right? Now there is air around us, right? It is common knowledge, it is science. We all know that air is all around us, but at times we don't feel the air, right? Only when there is wind or the air is moving, we start to really feel that air. But we can still create an inference because we are living, because we are breathing, there must be air around us, right? So this form of knowledge is called inference, and in Sanskrit it's called anuman, right? So that is the second criteria of right knowledge. And the third criteria is agama. Now the way agama Swamiji translates is right or valid authority, right? So valid authority means somebody or someone who has right to testify on that subject, right? So in matters of say science, say suppose there's say in a particular domain, if there's a scientist, say suppose a particle physicist, right, who has done a lot of research, who has done PhD in a particular area of physics, right? So that particular person is the valid authority to talk about a phenomena which is related to his domain, right? Similarly, say suppose there is a car mechanic, right, and if something goes wrong with the car, now that car mechanic could be a valid authority to talk about or to investigate or to give his testimony for what has happened or what might be the problem or how can we fix it, right? Similarly, on a spiritual path, Guru is a valid authority because Guru is someone, as we all know from our level 1, level 2 classes, that Guru, or level 3 classes specifically, that Guru is someone who himself has seen the truth, has realized the truth, and then can point us to the truth, right? So there are two qualifications. One, the person should have himself be realized, and second, should be able to bring out that truth for the disciple or for the seeker, right? So that person then becomes a valid authority in the matters of spiritual discipline, right? So these three things are needed to say something as pramana, to say something as right of right knowledge or right conception, right? We'll try and come back to this sutra again. Moving on, then Patanjali in the next sutra then would talk about the second vritti, right? So the first vritti was right conception, and then there are these three aspects of right conception or right knowledge. Then the next one is viparyaya, right? Viparyaya means wrong conception, right? Or incorrect knowledge or misconception, right? And the way Swamiji describes or translates this sutra, he says that a wrong understanding is mistaking the true nature of that which is being considered, right? So essentially, in say suppose now, how do we differentiate between praman and viparyaya? So in praman, there is an object, there is a perception, and the perception and the understanding of that perception is in alignment, is in sync with the object, right? So what we are perceiving and what the object being perceived, both are same, right? And that is why it is praman. So it's in a way, it's evidence, it's self-evident of what we are trying to understand or trying to know, right? That is why it's called praman. In viparyaya, what we are saying is that the understanding is sort of devoid of that true, or in a way is misrepresenting that object of perception, right? It's like we have perceived something, but then we are making a completely different sense of that perception, right? And we'll come to a few examples, but it is quite easy for us to really reflect and understand this kind of vritti also, right? It's like something happens, right? Or say suppose in our office, somebody says something, right? Say a colleague said something, right? We hear that, right? And suddenly we completely twist that into a completely different connotation, and we take it upon ourselves that I have been wronged, or there was a incorrect statement made about me or about what I have done, etc. Right? So there is a perception, but the inference of that perception or the understanding born of that perception is incorrect, right? That's why it's called incorrect or misconception or misperception, right? That is called viparyaya. The Now we'll move on to the third vritti, and the third vritti is, as we discussed, it's imagination, right? Which in Sanskrit is called, or Patanjali says, vikalpa, right? Vikalpa means other, right, or alternate, right? So vikalp means essentially, and the way Swamiji translate is understanding that is based on untruth, right? So it is imagination or imaginary. Imaginary means something which is based on untruth, right? So it's essentially what we are thinking about. The object itself is not true or non-existent, right? And that's why it's called imagination, right? Now there's a subtle, if you really try and understand and look at it, there's a subtle theme cutting across all of these definitions, right? That all of these definitions, in fact, any vritti that we'll pick, that vritti needs to have an object at the center, right? Because a vritti is really an energy or a whirlpool moving or revolving around a center, right? So there has to be something at the center which is really fueling that vritti, which is really empowering, energizing, or sustaining that vritti, right? So in each of these five-fold classifications of vrittis, there is a particular nature of attachment. There's a particular nature of that uh, sort of the center, which is really holding together this entire setup of energy or setup of vritti, right? And then as we look at it, it will be easy to look at, easy to infer or understand that it is really our attachment to that object which is really sustaining that whole setup of vritti, right? And if we could only control or in a way obstruct or restrain our minds in becoming sort of engrossed with that object, with that center, we can sort of restrain that immersion or that infatuation of our mind, right? So, and I'll come to what those objects are once we finish through all of these. So in Vikalpa, actually, there is our whole conception is based on something which is not even true, right? Hence, it is a fanciful idea or an imaginary idea, right? And the way sutra goes, just for our sort of understanding, or rather at least some familiarity, the way the Sanskrit of the sutra goes, Patanjali says, viparyayo mithya jnana atad rupa pratishsthanam, right? So viparyaya mithya jnanam. So viparyaya, which is the kind of vritti we're talking about. So rather it was about the first one. So viparyaya is the vritti about sort of misconception. Mithya jnana means conception of something which is false, right? So mithya means imaginary, illusory, or rather illusory. Jnanam is knowledge or conception, and atadrupa means that is that which is not, right? The form is not what we are really perceiving, right? That is why it's called viparyaya. And it is pratisthana means that which is supported by, right? So if our conception, our knowledge is supported by something where the understanding is not same as that object, then it is viparyaya, right? And as we were talking about imagination, right, or the vritti of imagination, the way Patanjali Sutras goes is it in the Sutra 1.9, Patanjali says, Shabda Jnana Anupati Vashtu Shunya Vikalpaha. Right. So Shabda Gyan, which means in a way idea or a verbal knowledge, but essentially it's not as much. Uh, sorry, was there a question? Okay, I'll move on. So let me also spotlight. Yes. Okay. So essentially, when we talk about imagination, imagination is about a conception or a knowledge of something which is devoid of a true object, right? So Patanjali says that vastu shunya, right? So there it is devoid. Shunya means devoid. Vastu means the object. So it is devoid of the object which we are conceiving, right? Say, so it's essentially imaginary, right? So if we are, say, suppose we do a meditation and there is a vision, right? Now vision is something, or in our sleep we are dreaming about something, right? And that dream is about something which has never happened, right? So it is devoid of a true object, right? It is devoid of a true experience, and that is why it is going to be called vikalpa, right? Or imagination, right? That is the definition of imagination by Patanjali, right? So this is the Sutra 1.9. Next, we'll go to the fourth vritti, which is as we were talking, called nidra, right? When Patanjali has described it. So the way Swamiji translates this sutra, Sutra 1.10 or 10th sutra, is nidra or sleep is attachment to nothingness, right? So it is really in a way. So we will come to the description of it, but it is really liking that abhava, right? That is that sort of that experience of no thing in particular, right? So it's when we say nothing, it does not mean there is nothing, right? And that's what Patanjali is trying to clarify, that even while in our sleep there are vrittis, right? And he is Patanjali here is not talking about dreams, right? Dream would be called vikalpa in the Patanjali's taxonomy of vrittis, right? Patanjali is talking about that state of deep sleep, like that is in Sanskrit sometimes also called shushupti, right? So there is swapna, which is more like dream-like state, and then there is shushupti, which is a state of a deep sleep, right? Where we are really completely immersed or attached to that experience of no thing, right? No thing in particular, right? And that is what is defined as nidra, right? And the way the sutra goes is Patanjali says, abhav pratyalambana vritti nidra, right? So abhav means an experience. Pratyaya means a perception sorry, rather abhav means non-existence, right? Pratyaya means experience or perception. Alambana means support, right? So Patanjali is saying that when our conception or when our perception is devoid of any experience, right? That kind of a vritti is called the vritti of nidra, right? So when we are engrossed in such a deep state, in such a deep sleep, that we are not really having any other sort of conceptualization. Even then, there is a subtle conceptualization which is going on, which is called nidra, right? That is the definition as per Patanjali. And then the next verse and the fifth vritti, which Patanjali is going to talk about, is, as we discussed, is smriti or memory. And as Swamiji translates this verse 1.11, the 11th verse, is memory is clinging to or refusing to abandon any ideas of objects that return to mind, right? So essentially, smriti or memory, as we generally know, is about experience, right? Something which has happened in the past and our reflection on that, right? But more than that, Patanjali is saying that there is a tendency to really being attached to that experience, that memory, and trying to relive that memory again and again and again and again, right? And that tendency is really creating that vritti of smriti, right? Of memory, right? So now, once again, I'll just quickly remind. So these are the five-fold classifications or five-fold or five kind of vrittis which Patanjali is talking about. And these five vrittis are pramana, viparyaya, nidra, vikalpa, nidra, and smriti, right? So these are the five kind of vrittis. Praman means right knowledge. Viparyaya means wrong knowledge or wrong conception. Vikalpa means imagination or fancies, right? Nidra means sleep or deep sleep. And smriti means memory, right? Now, as we were talking earlier, if we closely look at the definition and the nature of vrittis, and in fact, a lot of the times the mistake we make is that we think that these are just for understanding, right? As we were earlier touching upon, that these are just for theoretical knowledge, right? But if we look closely, there in a way, the reason why Patanjali is really describing and giving, in fact, one sutra to each of these is so that we can really understand the nature of these vrittis, right? So each of these vrittis has a particular formation, right? A particular nature, right? And if only we could understand that nature, if only we know how it works, uh, just like master says, right, that awareness precedes control. If only we could understand the nature of this vritti, we'll be able to control that vritti as it is sort of trying to proliferate, right? So it's like there is a seed thought, there's a seed desire, and then there is a small amount of energy which has just started to sort of revolve around it because we have given it our attention, right? And as we give it more attention, it starts to become sort of bigger, right? And starts to develop a kind of attachment, right? We, as that consciousness, start to become identified as it becomes stronger, right? And it pulls our identity. And then in that identity, we start to sort of lose the control over this whole sort of genesis or generation of vritti, right? But if only we could have controlled our mind going into that vritti, right? We could have nirodh, or we could have obstructed, or we could have restrained that natural flow of mind towards that object, towards that vritti, and we would be saved from that klishta, right? And that's why Patanjali is saying there these are of two kinds, which means all of these vrittis have a klishta kind and an aklishta kind, right? Which means that they can either give us suffering, or they may not give us suffering, right? They will obviously not give us happiness or joy, but they need not give us suffering, right? Or that second order of suffering that we were talking about when we started, right? And that is where, if you could just let it go, right, as it starts to proliferate, we control our mind and let it go, we will be sort of, we in a way, we will transform that vritti into a klishta, and then we'll be saved from being sort of, if impacted, immersed, or completely taken over by that vritti, right? So now, as we were discussing earlier, if you look at the definition of each of these five vrittis, they describe a particular formation, a particular mental or formation of our consciousness, right? And each of these formations has an object at the center, right? So when we first started, the first of this vritti, which is about pramana, right? That which is right knowledge. If you look at it, at the center of it is an object, right? Is an object which is perceived through the senses of perception, right? It could be, say, I'm looking at this laptop, right? When I'm looking at the screen, there is a perception. And as we discussed in the last class, whenever there's a perception, there is a vibration in the consciousness, right? Because to perceive something, consciousness, or the mind, first of all, the which is an instrument of consciousness, has to really sort of, in a way, uh, resonate or vibrate with the frequency of that object which is we are trying to sort of perceive, right? So whenever we are perceiving something, there is a vritti, right? But because I'm not really sort of identifying with that, I'm not really invested with that, it does not really bind me, right? It does not bring suffering. It is not klishta kind, because I am not investing in that, right? But if only, say, suppose this is the first time I'm seeing a laptop, this is the first time I've bought a laptop, and I have so much feelings for this object. If this is my laptop and I want to sort of take care of it, and I'll have so much happiness out of this laptop, that I start to form a bond with it. And then what it creates is, it creates a klishta kind of perception. So I'm still perceiving an object, and there is a right perception, right? Because I'm perceiving and knowing what I'm perceiving, but still, because I'm getting attached with that perception, it can pull the energy down and it can bind me, right? And that can then lead to desire, that can lead to attachment, that can lead to all the further kleshas which proliferate because of this attachment, right? But if I could just observe it and just move on, then there is no real investment. There is no sort of self-developed sort of attachment, as Swamiji describes a vritti, right? So because I am not invested in it, I am not defining myself, my my likes, my craving for this object, right? Uh, So in case of Pramana, the object itself is that center to which our sort of vrittis are moving, our sort of energies are sort of revolving, right? In case of Viparyaya, in case of which is, as we described earlier, which is a wrong conception or misconception. So in case of wrong conception, what is happening? The object is, there is a perception, right? But our conception of that object is different, right? And in fact, this is of the most common kind, right? Because what happens, essentially what is happening whenever we are perceiving, there is a layer of perception which is in between what we are perceiving and our perception, right? And this is exactly sort of what happens in all kind of perceptions, right? So whenever we are perceiving, it's actually the perception is not just the true raw sensations, but a lot of our own conditions, our own desires, our own identifications, which comes into while we are defining that particular vritti. So I'll try and explain this. So what is happening is when we are, say, suppose, say, as we were discussing, or when we are looking at the example, right? Say, suppose we are in office, right? And somebody said something, right? Somebody said something about us or maybe our work, right? Our work ethic, for example, right? Now we observe that, right? And perhaps that person who was trying to say was actually trying to say something positive about us, right? The person was trying to sort of probably highlight say suppose a positive suit. Say suppose person was trying to say that we as a colleague, I am sort of collaborative, or I'm sort of I work hard, right? Work hard on sort of on something which we have to complete, or project. It could be a product project, whatever, right? So as a, say suppose that is the kind of perception, right? Which as a person I hear, right? But say my mind then creates a misconception about it, and it goes into a different tangent, imagining the person is saying that I work too hard, right? Or that I work inefficiently, or that I work hard just to make it hard for others, right? Something like that. And what happens? Suddenly, the same perception of what has been said, I take it into a completely different view, right? And then what happens? So first, there is, in a way, there is praman, right? There is a perception. There's an object of perception. Then, in a way, if I'm not sort of clear, if I'm not and why is this happening is obviously because of a lot of conditioning, a lot of aversion from past experiences, a lot of conditions or conditionalities in my mind, right? Which is affecting this perception, right? Which is the real problem with the vrittis, right? So what they're doing is they are sort of misrepresenting what is truly in front of us, right? And what it creates a vritti of viparyaya. It creates a vritti of false conception. And then what happens? Then because I identify with that, I feel that what I've been told is that I want to make life, or I want to make others' life miserable, right? By working so hard, by working harder just to impress others, I'm making the life of others also hard, right? And that what it does, it creates it creates a kind of a self-identifying principle for myself, right? And then that starts to create a new vritti, or maybe sort of reinforce an already existing vritti. And then what it does, it sort of takes us far and far away from truth. And then before we know it, we move into a even bigger vritti, which is a vritti of vikalpa, right? Imagination, which means now that we start imagining, oh, what this person, if the person is saying this to me, then imagine what this person must be telling to someone else, what the person may be telling to the boss, what the person may be telling to other team members, or team members from other or colleagues from other teams, etc., etc., etc. Right? And what it creates a proliferation of this whole sort of identity, and it reinforces, it gives energy to that vritti, which started with a perception, has now grown into and gradually becoming out of control of of basically expanding, or sort of expanding our identification with this vritti, which is going to give us more and more suffering, right? Because the next time the person is saying something, the next time person is talking to somebody, our mind will start to conceive that the person is going to say something negative about us, right? And that is what is the core problem with vrittis, right? What it creates a conceptual layer, right? It's almost like looking the world through these colored glasses, right? As we generally call, right? And then whatever we perceive gets conditioned, gets disturbed, gets distorted by what these vrittis sort of we have stored, right? And then it sort of gradually takes us away from reality, and then also sucks our energy, and then sort of drowns us into this whole sort of whirlpool of emotions and all that, right? And that is what we are trying to control. And so imagine if in the very moment we heard that statement, and if you could just sort of notice it casually and just let it go, even if there is, say, suppose there is a misconception, we sort of correct that, right, with the vritti of right conception, which is to then use the vritti of, or rather the second and third sort of criteria of the first or the vritti of right knowledge, which is as we discussed, the second quality of right knowledge comes from inference, right? So then we have to employ our inference, saying why would this person speak ill of me, right? Or we could infer through, has this person ever said something about something like this about me or someone else, right? Is this person generally of this kind of behavior or not, right? So then we are employing this vritti of anuman, right, of inference, to really consolidate what we are perceiving, right? To correct if there is any aberration, if there is any distortion to what we are observing. But say, suppose if our anuman also fails, right? And if this anuman also says that maybe this person is like this, right? Then what we do? Then we employ the third factor, the third aspect of pramana, which is of valid authority, right? Which is then sort of trying to concur this either by the same person or by someone who knows that person very well, or maybe the boss, etc., right? Whoever we feel is the valid authority on that matter, consulting with that person then gives us the final say, or it's like triangulating all on that perception with all three sides in a way to reinforce our idea of what is or what truth is, right? And that is why when we are doing this, in a way, we are protecting us from all the other vrittis we can go into and all the other pain and suffering it can bring, right? And that is what we are really trying to avoid. Right now, this is just one sort of way to look at it, right? In a way, this is just more like a psychological sort of way to look at the vrittis. But in a yogic way, whenever we are doing any kind of spiritual practice, right? All the time, what we are really trying to do is to control these vrittis from proliferating, right? Which and essentially, which is the way it is happening is again going back to the earlier sutra. The our identity could either be sort of involved with our own self, the drashtu, right, the seer, the witness, our true self, or it could be involved with the vrittis, the vritti sarupyam. So we could either be drashtu sarupyam or vritti sarupyam, right? Now all spiritual practices is trying to do, and these could be karma yoga, bhakti yoga, gyan yoga, all the technique, any practice you mentioned, right? All these practices, what they're trying to do is they're trying to take us out of this vritti sarupyam and place us back into that drashtu sarupyam, right? So when we are doing Hong Song, for example, right? We are doing Hong Song, we just sat, we're just focusing on the breath, we're chanting mentally Hong and so, and suddenly there's a vritti, there's a thought, right? And the vritti for a brief moment takes sort of our attention, right? And in that moment, now either we could completely immerse in it, right? Or if if our awareness is strong, if our mindfulness is strong, we could just observe that vritti and take our attention back and place it back on the breath, right? So what we have done, we have taken our attention, our awareness from that vritti and placed it back on the breath, right? But if say suppose we are not able to do, what will happen? We immerse our identity, we become one with that vritti, and then vritti starts to proliferate, and then after some time we realize, oh, I was in a vritti, I was in thought, I was in mind, right? And then we pull back. But this pulling back, what it does, it creates this feedback, right? Which helps us remember that this is the process. This is the process of disentangling our identity, disentangling our our attention, our awareness from a vritti, and then just letting that vritti go, and then it becomes a klishta. In a way, it becomes non-painful or not binding, not creating further sufferings for us, right? If you could come back, right? So these are again there are a lot which is also said in the commentaries by Swamiji, right, when he's talking about all of it. But one important point is to really understand that whatever we are doing, right, until we are in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, there are all vrittis are always operating, right? We can never get away from vritti. What we can do is while there is a vritti, first thing is we could sort of reinforce positive vrittis, right? So in a way, if there's a vritti which is of higher kind, say suppose a vritti of satsang, right? A vritti of chanting, a vritti of reading books by Swamiji, by Master, by saints, right? So that vritti in a way reinforces our tendency, our energy to go up, right? So that is one. That is, once we know that we are in a vritti, or if we have a choice between a lower vritti and a higher vritti, we should choose a vritti which takes at least our energy up, so that it gives back the control, so that whenever next time we are in a vritti, we can take our awareness, our identification back, right, and place it in God, place it in our Guru, etc. Right. So that is one side of it, which is being able to sort of identify that we have we sort of got lost in the vritti. And the next part is being able to sort of use that positive vritti, and then once we have established ourselves in a positive vritti, then being able to move beyond that vritti and place ourselves back in that state of drashtu, right? And that is what we do when we sit in silence. So first, when we do hongso, what we are doing is we are really empowering our awareness, our purusha, our buddhi, rather, purusha is more like a witness, but our buddhi, our vivek, to be able to pull the awareness back into its own self. And then once we have done that abhyasa, once we have learned that practice, and then once we sit in silence, and then when we sort of relax and open us into that stillness, then we develop the real wisdom, right? Which that wisdom then brings us vairagya, right? And then that vairagya we carry forward into our practice, into the abhyasa, and then abhyasa further reinforces vairagya, right? And that is the reinforcement, the vicious positive circle or positive loop, which reinforces our ability to go further on spiritual path. And in fact, that is what Patanjali is going to talk about in the next verse, which we will probably take in the next class, when he says that abhyasa vairagya tan nirodha, right? So then he says that what is the path to that nirodha is through abhyas and vairagya, right? Through practice and through dispassion, right? Or non-attachment, right? So that is what is again a very succinct discussion. Obviously, we'll still try and come back to these verses and a greater understanding of these vrittis further. But the crucial point is to be really aware of these vrittis while we are doing our day-to-day work, while we are really these vrittis are really popping up in our awareness and our consciousness all the time, and being able to pull our mind back of these vrittis, to nirodha, to restraint, to neutralize these vortices before they become monsters, they become sort of tsunamis of whirlpools, right? So that is the whole path of spiritual life, of a spiritual seeker. So let us just take a moment before we end this class. Just try to center, feeling the grace of the Gurus, the blessings, that we could go through these subtle, these profound teachings, and that we could implement them in our practice, in our daily lives. Om Shanti. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining, and joy to you all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Shashank, for a lovely
Shashank.
session.
Thanks, Shashank.